I think a city can only exist if it has people who love to live there. People who give their commitment to the streets they live, to the neighborhood they live. That's the only way a city can exist. So I think it's never simple to make a family house. I think you always have to think, where is this house standing? How do you connect to the street? How do you connect to the garden? How do your children come home? What happens if it's raining and everyone comes home with his bike and his dripping stuff? How do you get that into the houses? And what happens if you have children have a lot of homework? And what happens if you have a birthday party? I really want to make family houses where you can have your family life. And I will never say that every family house is the same. There is so much difference. So yeah, I like designing family houses, and I will never say it's all the same.
Complex housing is called complex because it involves a lot of different aspects. And so it involves, first of all, the idea of designing buildings in a neighborhood rather than just buildings isolated. I think often in the United States, we think that housing is actually a building, whereas in the Netherlands, it's conceived of as a part of the urban fabric. The exhibition at the University of Minnesota, called Dutch Complex Housing, was based on a book that I wrote, published by Routledge, called Complex Housing, Designing for Density. Because I thought I really also wanted to have an impact on the local community here, I thought along with the exhibition it would really be interesting to have a symposium and actually to bring some of the people involved in building and designing those places here to speak with our local community, because I thought that they could learn from us and we could also learn from them.
I want to welcome all of you. So many of you have come to hear our wonderful speakers and to join in the reception afterwards. So the Netherlands, which is sort of the fundamental reason we're here, is to talk about the differences and the things we can learn between the Netherlands and the United States. What are the things that are going on in housing? And so to give you just a little bit about the Netherlands, of course, these are some pictures that capture some of the things that people normally think of in the Netherlands: the windmills, the canals, bicycling, tulips, all those things. And the reason that we think of that is because the Netherlands, as you probably all well know, is below sea level. So one thing is the fact that you have to constantly pump. And what is the result of that? The result of that is that people have to cooperate.
I think one of the things that surprised me was talking with the developers of how, at that time, how aware they were of the importance of the role of the architect. Whereas often I think in developers, although I don't think that's true so much of the nonprofit developers in our country, but I think often the developers take such a important role, that the architect's role is suppressed. But I think that the value of the architect's role and the potential then for the residents also, that in the developers, for example, when I talked to the developer of La Grande Cour, Ryan Willem said that they pressed the architect, and they pressed the architect actually to make balconies, because the architect did not want to have balconies. They wanted to have a smooth envelope. And they felt that the balconies were going to be really important for the residents, that would be something that they would really value. And in the end, I think that the balconies actually make the architectural interest. So there's sort of this play of the role of the residents, the role of the developers, and the role of the architects that I thought was very, very interesting, and to learn more about how sometimes the things you would think would be something architects would be asking actually was asked by the residents, and in some cases the things you think would be the developers would be interested were asked by the architects, and vice versa. So you never really, that there seemed to be more of a dialogue that we don't seem to always have in our country, that there's more of an open discussion. I guess that's maybe the thing we talked about in the whole history of the Netherlands, because of the history of the country where they're below sea level and every kind of development requires discussion about the water and a discussion about developing projects. The land has to be very carefully manicured, which created this need for urban planning, that this idea of discussion carries over into all kinds of aspects of the political system and even to the housing development. So I think that this idea of the Netherlands being below sea level is a really critical aspect of why the housing is done the way it is, and the whole notion of complex housing comes from a country where you have to have a discussion. And I think this is especially something that we can learn from, that the discussion doesn't have to be based on being in a dangerous situation. We can do it because it actually works better to create better housing.
So my opinion about participation is discussion. 90% of the plans, there was a research, is never realized. A plan is provoking discussion, and that's very good, because then you don't have a blueprint and you don't know what the result is. And if you open the result, is my opinion, will always be surprising and maybe also very good. Why not? So that's what we did.
And actually, it's all about this. It's about designing kind of small urban lots and not big city blocks as a whole. This was the starting point. And numerous kind of workshops where always in the beginning presentations were made to people that were not a collective, but we were working with neighborhood people, police, education from the center of Wilwijk. And in the different models, we emphasized explicitly on this type of architecture that is composed of different viewpoints, different people, and different angles.
So the tenants should ask to the management, what is your idea of your social behavior? What is the idea of what do you do with the profit? ISR, investissement social responsable, or what is it in English? Social responsible investment, SRI. That's the power of the tenant organization, to speak with the leaders and say, why are you there on earth? But that's for every enterprise on earth in these days. Where are you there for? Yeah?
Another aspect of complex housing is that generally it's dense. It's not necessarily as dense as small places in Hong Kong, for example, but it's dense compared to a lot of the housing that we do in the United States. And and then in the complex housing that it was shown in the exhibit and that was displayed in the symposium is a range of densities that I think is something that we could emulate here in the United States in our dense housing.
Well, the Beeklaan is a project that stitches actually a very noisy street with a lot of traffic to the very quiet streets where you have single-family houses. It's an area that used to be not the nicest place in a very nice neighborhood, but this neighborhood had all kinds of difficult problems in this area, and when they gradually grew out of control, the decision was made to replace the existing houses by newly built. If we would have a symposium about urban lifestyle issues, or urban food, or urban running and working in flex urban coffee spaces with a barber and organic food, we would be certainly the good guys. We would be hip. But as soon as the word housing comes in, or worse, social housing or public housing, people move on. Not sexy, not hip. How stupid. What is a city if there is no housing? Such a city does not exist. You need a lot of people to begin with. Best would be people who love their homes, who like their neighborhoods, and who give their commitment to the place they live. And we think it is very important to make affordable, beautiful new houses that are, of course, not so big, but that they do have a front garden and a back garden and room for every child. Because if you don't, people with low incomes will only live in old houses. Kind of city is that?
Well, perhaps the most important thing from my point of view is how you can develop a project that mixes incomes. That may be the most important thing. But I think along with that comes this idea of mixing different housing types, because you can mix different lifestyles by having a variety of housing types. So that kind of generates this different, all these different people that would inhabit a single dwelling and make a neighborhood that is not just of a single type of person or single income. So then another aspect of that is, as I mentioned before, the notion of mixed functions. I think in the neighborhood you want to have not just all housing and not just all one type of neighborhood. You want to have mixed housing that reflects a variety of ages of people, a variety of incomes, a variety of ethnicities. And so that requires having a variety of housing types and a variety of ownership, because some groups need to rent and some groups need to, and also a variety of people, such as in some of the projects we have group homes for people with developmental disabilities, or group homes with people with schizophrenia, or group homes for people, or housing for the elderly that's embedded in the projects. So it's a variety of different types of housing that's not just reflected in a housing type, but in the people that might live in the neighborhood. So we want to have an area that meets the people of all needs, that has a really vital kind of mix of people.
This is the Vrijburg behind the Haan, and there's a child care center here, and there's a group home on the corner for adults with schizophrenia, and this beautiful courtyard, of course, is shared by the community. And then the greenhouse is often used as a teen center, and then on the other corner is a cafe downstairs and the theater upstairs. So there's lots of things going on here, and it serves not just this group of residents but also the community all around.
Hello, I am Petra. I was invited here as a resident of Vrijburg and to tell you how life is over there. We have a motto in Vrijburg, and that is more than living behind your own front door. And it makes it different to live there than in the average street. I think it's an important place because all the front doors come together at the central courtyard, and that's why you run into each other a lot and you see your neighbors. The day when I was leaving, I went to swim very early with a friend of mine who lives there as well, 10 to 7. Then we came back in our bathing gowns. Then we saw other people, neighbors in their bathing gowns going to the water. And then I was at my front door, and then my upstairs neighbor came in his bathing gown to go and pick up the paper from the mailbox. And I don't know what about you, but I've never had that in other houses before.
And I think this is so fascinating to us because we live in, such a divisive country where everyone has such different interests and different wants and different needs. And even in, places like Minneapolis and St. Paul, people want this, people want that, people want that. It's very hard to bring, it doesn't happen where the developer and the architect, they try to get community input, but where the developer, the architect, and the future residents all collaborate together to create the project. And so it's a collaborative thing, but each person also gets sort of what they want. So
I think that's the secret of the success.
Yes.
Because people get what they want. Because they've
okay.
been involved from the start. So it was also that, of course, some people have 4 children, they get more bedrooms. We all have different wishes.
Yeah.
And people are all active. We want to participate, and I think that's that's also why it can stay like that. It's not that people think, oh, nice house, I buy it and it's mine. You know, it's really.
It's also about making a community,
Yeah, right.
not only a building.
Right. So.
And then the people are, I think I can say you're proud because the building has a name.
Right.
It says one thing, but it's a part of the story.
Yeah.
What was so fascinating to me about the Dutch housing was, first of all, the way they fit into their context, and in some cases the way they contrasted with their context, that just seemed so architecturally interesting. Each project had its own character. It fit into the neighborhood in a very different way, but fit and seemed to be a powerful architectural expression. In some cases rather modest, and in other cases very powerfully contrasting or kind of shocking in some cases, like La Grande Cour. When I first saw it, I was a bit surprised that anyone would be able to build a building like that. Or similarly with the Museum, some of these projects are kind of sculptural in their effect, and yet when you look at them and how they developed and how the people live there, they're very livable. So there was this combination of the livability of the projects with the architectural expression that I just found totally fascinating, and especially because the expressions were not at all similar to each other, whereas I think in our country we tend to have more similar projects. So one of the things I think that creates the diversity in architecture is the diversity in program. So for example, at the Opgaan, where it was actually developed with the church group, you have a very different kind of a need for working with, for expressing a religious structure within a housing structure. So that creates one kind of a visual and actually functional kind of idea that operates in the city in a quite different way from, let's say, the project at in de Beeklaan, where you have housing that is on a street, very much a public street, that has it's developed as with commercial on the ground and then housing above. So that's different from a church on the ground, or a commercial creates very different types of needs for the way the thing is expressed, for the way the thing is built, and the way it fits into its urban context. So that is one of the things that creates this difference between one architectural expression and another.
You know, trust is important, and what's important to be a team. If you come up with a proposal like this, a combination of church and housing, you have to convince so many people. You have to convince the congregation of the church. You have to convince the municipality with many meetings, also in the neighborhood. So, at a certain moment, it becomes really a project, and then people believe in it, and then we could continue. So, we had to cooperate, not as a fight, but to work together, and then I think for me it's helpful. Interesting also that Henk Jan, he is not, let's say, a normal developer, but he is educated as an architect. That helps also to work on the project.
It's true that many of these buildings are very distinct looking, and that was one of the things that was interesting. That's one of the reasons I think I got interested in them in the first place, because they all had a distinctive look and looking very different from each other, whereas in our country, the projects that are dense tend to look very much alike. And I thought, well, why is this, and how is this, and how can we learn from that? So that was one of the things that I thought was really interesting. So they each have very different circumstances. So we have some, like the project I spoke about before, the Museum, which is on this very long park in the suburbs. And then we have other ones, like Carniceland, which is on an urban plaza that was developed specifically as a new urban plaza to create a sense of community of that particular project outside of Dordrecht. So each of these has a very strong identity. So that project edges this urban center and has the tower, because the original mayor that new town thought every town should have a tower that you could see from the distance, but there was no church anymore that was interested in building. So he developed this project to have a tower that would be visible from the whole surrounding area to identify the center of this town. So there's all these different aspects of these projects that create something very distinct. At the same time, they all are sizable, and so they have a presence that is you can't ignore in the city pattern. I think that given certain circumstances, it could be replicated anywhere. But I think you have to have, first of all, an interest in a lot of those things, so you have to think that it's valuable. Well, I think one of the things that's really important is to acknowledge that designers do have a role in making our places better. That's really important, and I think that the urban design is the first step. That I think that we have to be aware that we don't want to design housing apart from neighborhoods. That the way you design a city is to understand how the neighborhoods need to evolve. What does a neighborhood need to be viable? How does housing fit into that? So then when if we get the cities to design their neighborhoods, that will be a very important first step, because then the housing that is in the neighborhood will function as an elemental piece of that neighborhood. I think we've already begun to take on the character of the mixing of different types of functions together. But I think so that then, in other words, we need to have a circumstance where there's more understanding of how you place a housing project in a neighborhood. For example, in the Netherlands, one of the things, when I was speaking to one of the urban designers, he was saying that that in Amsterdam they were very concerned about certain neighborhoods becoming very single income. And so one of the things that they required in Amsterdam was that you would have to build projects that were mixed income so that you wouldn't have neighborhoods that were only of one income. So I think that if we were committed to that here, that could make a big difference in what we do. And so we just have to be looking at how we can make agreements that certain things would happen so that we don't have these kinds of segregated neighborhoods. My own thought is that probably this would happen within certain cities that would be very motivated to develop these projects, and that they would make their codes and their requirements for any kind of urban development require certain amounts of light and air, certain exterior, certain kinds of gardens and balconies that would be required, as well as mix of income. So I think that in order to develop this type of housing, you need to have an urban group that's committed to that, whether it's the government or the nonprofit agencies or whatever. I think there needs to be some agreement that you would do this, because I think otherwise it won't happen.
I think we're starting to see some examples of how to do mixed income housing, but it's really the limitation at the moment is really about the way we finance stuff. And so we just need a new model that, again, demonstrates new ideas, proves to the typical capital market that something works, because then they all pile in. The minute they know that it works, there's plenty of people who will finance it. So it's really about, it's the same question as how do we get some of these other things that we want to happen. We need a little bit more of a fund that will invest in innovation. I don't know whose that is, some rich somebody, some government, some foundation, some institutional folks that say, let's try a whole bunch of different stuff so we can demonstrate some new ideas. And mixed income is one of those. There's more than one way to do it, but we need the right tools.
Working with capitalism and not working against it, I agree, but sometimes it's also, if there's an opportunity to change things for the better, you shouldn't let it pass.
When you live in a high density area or country, then you're used to community, because the distance between the people is so narrow that you meet each other. And if you meet each other, you start to think about, who do I want to meet? Who are these people? Not that you know everybody when you go in a station or on the street, but in a narrow street, it is a different opinion about that you live in a community. what I saw here in Minneapolis is that these vast distances, everyone has distance. Mm-hmm. Well, if you have so much distance, you don't have a community. You have a community on paper, mm-hmm. planned, mm-hmm. just, but not a community of people who felt it, mm-hmm. because you don't see anybody. Mm-hmm. And I think that's it has nothing to do with the question was what you can learn from the Dutch. I think that it's just a situation as it is. And the question is, are you satisfied by that situation, that this is the way Americans think about communities or neighborhoods?